Season 4 of Notebook on Cities and Culture is brought to you by Daniel Murphy, Polar Inertia, a journal of nomadic and popular culture online at polarinertia.com, and Medivate, a community and set of tools to help you build the kind of meditation practice you'd like to have, online at medivate.com. We're sitting here in your offices in Old Town Pasadena, or Old Pasadena as it's more commonly called these days. Before we set up anything else, when did you realize how walkable this specific place was?
Well, I've lived here for a while, for the past 10, 12 years, so I actually walk to the office, and so I'm very much aware how walkable Pasadena is. And when we were looking kind of for that first kind of walkability segment of a town or a city, it came very natural to us because all of us, because people have to commute into the office, but then we walk around for lunch, for errands, to the Apple Store. It's just or across to the park for lunch. It just comes very natural here. Yeah.
It is Notebook on Cities and Culture. I'm Colin Marshall, coming to you from the eminently walkable Old Pasadena, specifically from the offices of Rigler Creative, speaking with the man you just heard from, Thomas Rigler, the principal here at Rigler Creative. He's also the executive producer and creator of City Walk, a new television series from KCET and Link TV. It's about literally that, cities, walking in cities, where you can walk in cities, where you can't walk in cities, and the benefits of walking. Thomas has brought on, I'm delighted to have two more members of the team here. Who else do we have?
So we have Steve Reich, supervising producer on the show, and a writer really who helped us frame the story very much from the beginning. And then Caitlin Starowicz, who's also a supervising producer and has been very much involved in the production side of things since really almost we began collecting stories for that. It's been 2 years now, and that's a fantastic situation to be, to have somebody with very fresh eyes and somebody who knows everything we filmed in every town, knows kind of the participants everywhere, and the three of us then kind of sat down and created that show together by really writing our way into it. Because this thing you mentioned before, the standalone segments that could be 2 minutes long, 90 seconds, or 7.5 minutes, and then become almost like a short film, that was our intention. We thought that's something that we don't see anymore as a format on television, and we wanted to create something like that is almost like a free form, yet has a very distinctive style to it.
I want to throw this to whomever wants to explain this part of it, but I was at a screening of 2 recent episodes recently. You guys talked about how this started as a project about the benefits, the health benefits of walking, purely that. And what was that first seed?
The first seed of the health benefits of walking?
Yeah, because now we have a show here we're watching about walking in cities and the cool things cities are doing about walking, and also the benefits of walking, but as I understand it, initially, the project was entirely about how much healthier you could be if you walk.
Mm-hmm. Well, we originally started focusing on the health benefits and quickly realized that it's not just health benefits, but it's benefits to community, to emotional benefits, to cities in general. The fact that people are out walking greatly benefits a city in the sense that people get to know each other, there's more interpersonal interaction, it's safer because people know their neighbors and actually get to interact more. And the more we delved into the subject, it just opened up in front of us that there are so very many benefits just beyond health itself. And it's just been completely eye-opening and fascinating.
But I think the key ingredient in the beginning was a project called everybodywalk.org, a nonprofit that initially researched the medical and health benefits of walking, and gave us kind of the initial really the initial funding, but then also the initial platform to go out there and look at all angles, and encouraged us to find all angles around walking. And nobody really knew what would be there. Nobody knew that we're in this watershed moment right now where the downtown areas in almost all cities across the country are becoming these centerpieces for urban life again, after 50, 60 years of kind of planning for traffic, planning for cars, and also losing its attraction because it got dangerous, it got neglected. Anywhere from Pasadena to all the way to New York City, downtown LA, every town we go to, we see the same thing. But the beginning was this nonprofit, everybodywalk.org, who had this specific kind of focus on it, and from there, just like Caitlin said, we were able to find a new life in the cities, and out of that then came many other stories we found, and then in the end, a Funny or Die spot that did it in a humorous way, and the opportunity to collaborate with KCET and turn it into kind of a stylish contemporary program.
What were some of the first stories that you guys discovered that made you realize there was a lot more to this than you're not going to get heart disease probably if you walk a lot?
We started living it ourselves.
Well, yeah, actually, I came onto this last year, and I live in Santa Monica, and our offices are in Pasadena, so of course I drove here every day until one day I'm looking at these, at all the walking things we're doing in public transportation, and I thought, hey, I can take the bus and I can take the Gold Line. And I started doing that and discovered that not only is it cheaper, it was getting me to walk more, and even when I was driving and parking like 15, 20 minutes away to actually get walks in. Of course, I was late to work every day, but here it was actually okay. So that was kind of a win-win situation.
And this speaks to something about Los Angeles. In a few years, you'll just be able to take one rail ride over here, over from Santa Monica to Pasadena, right? That's just going to be possible.
In Santa Monica, I can see them building the Expo line is heading to the beach right now, and I wish it would happen right away because it would be a lot easier just to get. Because I'll be able to walk to that and take that straight in. It'll be a lot faster to get in. But the other thing that happened is. The birth of this show came about by us looking at all these stories and then realizing that, as Thomas just said, that there's a wave of change happening across America right now. And we were lucky enough, the team was lucky enough to be documenting that for the past 2 years. And you could see inside of these individual stories that every city was like eager and every city is changing. And when we went to do this show, we could look and use some of the material from the earlier shoots and pull out those kinds of things and actually use kind of some of the same material, but look at it a different way to almost tell a different story. Instead of telling a health story, we're talking about an urban transformation story. And as Caitlin said earlier, it's a social story and about a community story. And one thing we've learned as we've been doing this show is that walking and pedestrian-friendly cities are kind of a impetus and a key to community and helping to bring us all together. So there's, beyond health benefits, there's psychological benefits, social benefits, and we like it more.
It is this moment that I had watching, I've watched all episodes of City Walk except for the one that's just about to premiere, and listeners, you'll be able to see it, well, this is going up August 1st, so tonight, in fact, on KCET, you can see the second screening of it, but I listened to the experts and the everyday people on the show talk about how much they like walking in cities and the things they discover and the benefits of cities that people are in and people are walking through, people are engaging with, and it all makes sense. And then I think it is a little bit like hearing somebody say, I know for the last 45 years, 50 years, we've been eating dirt, but get this, we can eat food. And it's true. But at the same time, it's like, what happened to where this became a fresh thing to say, I guess? You mentioned planning for cars, but that can't be all of it, can it?
That's a monster question. First, there's a shift, I think, in kind of the collective's mindset. I mean, that something needs to take place, and it occurred before we started looking for these stories, because we could see the traces everywhere already. We would go to Washington D.C., obviously New York City. And then, natural contenders like Denver and see enormous construction in progress with the sole purpose of not just kind of adding public transportation, but really opening communities, making them livable in a very broad way. And we what I think the way we saw it first was, or how it really registered with us, was we did this trip from New York City up to Boston and saw all these parks. So we started filming in Central Park, and then we moved up to Boston and we did Emerald Necklace and all kinds of other things there, and then realized this is the same guy in the middle of the 1800s, Frederick Olmsted, who built and designed and then oversaw in one lifetime all these parks. And then we went into other cities all the way to the LA River, and you see, wow, this guy had kind of the vision, but also the stamina to build and design parks and landscape, man-made landscape, in the best possible sense throughout the second half of the 1800s. And we were just blown away by that, because at the same time, in New York City especially, we saw Bryant Park, we saw the High Line, we saw all these things that were really the return of that mindset, where in the middle of the 1800s, the wealthy citizens of New York City decided we're not going to dedicate that prime real estate in the heart of Manhattan to more development. We're actually going to create a park, which means sensational loss in revenue, yet unbelievable increase and an incredible gift to a city that, this was tough. New York, Manhattan at that time. I mean, we've seen the movies. So at the same time, that arises in a way, we're seeing exactly the same thing. At least from my perspective, we're seeing exactly the same thing. But we're seeing it with kind of the mechanics are slightly different. They are, and maybe they are also returning a little bit to Olmsted funded his things. It's not that the city then suddenly steps in, or the states step in and say, all right, here are huge pots, like building highways. Now we're kind of identifying these resources and placing them in the hands of parks and recreation. It's very much citizen-driven, community-driven, neighborhood-driven. People raise incredible funds, of course, stimulated by the cities, the High Line, Bryant Park, but we're talking hundreds of millions of dollars that are raised with multiple sources, a lot of it corporate, a lot of it the communities themselves, some of it through the cities, and that mix takes place all across the country. And that's absolutely fascinating, because, where does this all come from? And it's done in an extremely interesting, most of the time, extremely interesting design, with an interesting design approach. It is, it's really kind of reinventing this for today. And that kind of really clicked with us. I said, wow, there's so much going on. We see this everywhere. What else is there? And then you go deeper and deeper and deeper.
Did there seem to be, does this spring from a buildup of frustration about the way cities had been for a long time? Did you guys sense that at all? Or is it is it more positive than that?
Well, it's a combination. There is a frustration, and it is more positive. Really, what you asked that question earlier, did this all start with a motor car? And the answer, I think, is yes. What happened is you have cars, and it's a new fun gadget that happened 100 years ago, and it's been here for 100 years, and we're discovering two things. One, not only is it changing the climate, all of this stuff, but on top of that, we're built to walk, and we kind of changed to people that would get in cars to go to place. There's like an old Buster Keaton film in the 20s where he was like a really rich guy, and the joke of the movie is he gets so wealthy, he gets in his car on one side of the street and drives to the other side of the street. And that was like the 1920s. So that's the beginning of it, when it was almost kind of a joke. And there are consequences to that. And some of the consequences have been health, which is where this thing started. But beyond that, a lot of it has to do with our community and things, and our sociability and things like that. And I think, as opposed to casting a negative light on cars, we're trying to cast a positive light on walking and on walkable cities and on redevelopment and redesign. Because as we do that, we rediscover more things about ourselves, but we also rediscover our community. So it's to me, it's a positive thing. But yeah, I think it actually started with cars.
Now, when you guys went out to shoot in all these American cities where these things are happening, what was the plan? When you got into one of these cities, when you got into a Boston, or when you were just here in Los Angeles, how did you go about it?
Well, it was very well researched. So we spent considerable time, we have a researcher on staff. She would prepare anything from interview partners to locations that pertain, organizations that pertain to that change and shift, and so based on, and that was weeks ahead of we would actually go there, and then we would go there with a very clear schedule already that would usually start with the list of interviewees, because we found really interesting people. They then introduced us to other interesting people or interesting new projects.
I always love that process.
Yeah.
Interesting people know each other. How about that?
It's amazing. It's really amazing. And in the end, this isn't, thousands of people moving this right now. There are, they do know each other. They come to conventions and they exchange thought, and they support each other. And so we keep bumping into people that then knew each other in D.C. We'll talk about the guy in New York, and they would have all these stories about each other, which allowed us to weave a film or a series of films together that where people in different cities reference each other's work. So we have a story about the Beltline coming up in the next episode. In this version here, there are, like 3 or 4 people talking about it, but we actually also collected voices on the Beltline in other cities because it's such a significant project in the country right now. And it, and it makes it much more interesting when you have all these different perspectives on something. That's kind of how this rolls. And then, if you go to DC, you have to talk to that guy, and let me make an introduction there. And because we had we were fortunate enough to have time. So we knew we don't have to knock this out in 2 weeks or so. We knew we would. We had initially we thought, okay, this is going to be a year, not of constant travel, but kind of some travel and then a lot of post-production where we could get prepared for more stuff. And that makes it so complex.
These connections would sprout up as you talk to people, as you went to cities. And even given all the research you had done already, you knew what you wanted. What else would surprise you when you actually got to these cities, when you were walking them yourselves, when you were talking to people who did walk them? I mean, people would know each other and they would shed light on each other's cities, but what stuff would just startle you, I guess, or surprise you in a more positive sense?
I feel like one of the most surprising things, in a great way, was just how enthusiastic people were about how they just were bursting to tell us about how walking had changed, like, their lives, had changed their community, had changed their cities, and that people were just raring to tell us about it. That people were so enthusiastic. It really was an absolute pleasure and a great surprise.
What I found interesting beyond, I have a background in, briefly, I wanted to become a landscape architect. So 20 years later, suddenly I'm staring at a project that didn't actually start as that, and I'm standing in all these parks. And so I'm kind of fascinated by that. But I have a certain skill set that allowed me to understand how this kind of came together and kind of to read that language a little bit. And so I was fascinated about that. What kind of was stunning was to see how much had already happened without the public actually knowing. That yes, the High Line or certain transportation things like Los Angeles would actually stick out, but that nobody had actually ever put this together. And that's really, I think, the accomplishment of KCET and the series, to say this is actually a national trend, a national conversation. They're all doing it because for some reason, everybody kind of flipped that switch and said, okay, we can tone down the cars a little bit. We can move back into the cities. It'll be healthy. The air will be okay. It'll be safe. But let's now start rebuilding that. And here are some resources to doing that. The fact that so much was already going on was stunning. And that nobody, even in our research, had actually pointed that out to us. And we were just kind of so we were kind of stumbling through it and then checking with the experts and say, hey guys, this is amazing. Why isn't this, that now there are all these books coming out. there's still, this is the series. We hope this is the defining series that will continue tell these stories, because there's just a ton of them. Hopefully, also do it on an international level, because the conditions are obviously slightly different. But this is a very, very strong trend, and that was just stunning. And kind of the craziest thing was to sit in DC or in Boston, and people and experts, city planners and developers would stand there and say, have you spent time in Los Angeles? Because that is the city of the future.
Right.
These guys are doing...
They all say that. It's interesting.
They all say that. Yeah. I mean, that was... We were thinking, were they making fun of us? Because they knew our office was in Pasadena. We thought, are you serious? And then... But that is the story.
Yeah, I mean, to add to that, I just had... In our upcoming episode, we have a segment on the Gold Line, where we travel the Gold Line,
which I wrote here, so very familiar with that.
Oh,
yeah. Now, I only discovered the Gold Line when I started commuting here to Pasadena, and like I said, I live in Santa Monica. So I was doing research on it because I wanted to find out how long it was, when it started. So I went on Wikipedia and looked it up, and I was surprised to see that the Gold Line was like one of the first, metro lines around. And I didn't even realize the metro had been in Los Angeles for over a decade. Right. And it's like, and now I'm sort of discovering the hub at Union Station. And there's still many people. I mean, the real surprise is that we do have an actual working public transportation system in this city, and unless you get on it, you don't know how to use it. I mean, we did a shoot at Ciclovia, and a lot of people were taking bikes on the metro, and many of them for the first time, because we were standing out there, and I was looking at people trying to figure out the machines. And in a funny way, what really has happened, it's what Thomas just said, which is the tracks have been laid for quite a while, for over a decade, and now people are finally starting to notice it. And I think our show is highlighting it really in our own backyard, and that actually is a little surprising.
When I left the screening you did at Soho House of the 2 episodes of City Walk, I was in the elevator with a nice lady who was there as well, and she asked me a question about the parking meters in the neighborhood, and I said, I don't know, I don't have a car.
It must have been Lady Gaga in the elevator with you.
It probably was. I don't know if it was the costume. And she asked some question about it. I said, I don't have a car. I don't know what the rules are here for the meters. And then she just says, after she had been sitting in the screening of City Walk, but you can't walk in Los Angeles. Like, earnestly, this wasn't a joke. And I just sort of laughed, but that speaks to a larger issue here, doesn't it?
Sure. Well, when I originally moved here 6 years ago, I had never had a car before. I was always big public transit user. I walked all the time, and I kind of assumed that I would be able to take public transit in LA, maybe naively. And when I told people, I took the bus here, or I took the metro, they were shocked and just thought it's so dangerous. How could you do that? And there is this kind of stigma that people have where they're afraid of the public transit without ever having actually gone on it. And once people do take it, they realize it's not scary at all, and it's totally usable and a very viable way to get around LA.
It smells so much less like urine than any of the other systems in America, from my experience.
Yeah, it smells really nice on the metros, and I would also say
comparatively nice.
But also, what's really nice is there is something very freeing. I mean, you were talking about parking meters. There's something really freeing about your car being parked at home, and when you're going somewhere, you don't have to think about where are you going to park, where's my car, how am I going to deal with this. And it just drops, and generally speaking, it drops you close to where you're going and offers an opportunity, to walk a couple of blocks to where you are. But being free of a car is it's liberating. And the public transportation here can get you places, and especially with the expansion of the metro, it goes to a lot of places people go. I mean, I've been making a lot of use of it even beyond work because it's fun.
What is it about Los Angeles? I mean, people will make fun, like you said, are they making fun of us when they say Los Angeles is the city of the future? But it is not in the top several hundred walking unfriendly cities in America, I would say. I mean, even if you think of major cities, I mean, people who make fun of Los Angeles, haven't they been to Phoenix or Dallas? It's these cities are no doubt doing things too, but even in the American context, Los Angeles is not the worst, and nor has it ever been the worst, has it?
Well, I mean, I'm not an urban planner, or this is not my field. But what living here for 20, 22 years now, and seeing through dozens of visitors from all kinds of places in the U.S. and from Europe. What people just don't understand, what is so hard to kind of wrap their head around, is that the city doesn't have a center, or appears not to have a center. Yet at the same time, or kind of a definitive center. At the same time, it consists of dozens of neighborhoods, and every and you just have to kind of experience and learn the language of this city through the neighborhoods. And then sometimes these are kind of your predominant areas that you use, and you don't necessarily have to drive the 40 miles across town to get somewhere and back for work or for anything else. This is also a city with an enormous culture of people working out of their private studios, their homes that have an I mean, this is the city where this is all possible, and people have found a way to kind of make these neighborhoods very, very workable. And as a result, the neighborhoods have always been walkable. I mean, Pasadena, yes, in the 70s and early 80s may still have been, pretty run down, but still there was the parks and the gardens were always there. You may not have actually walked through Old Town Pasadena at that point, but there were areas you go. And the same way with Silver Lake, Echo Park, and all the way to the west side. Montana. I mean, the neighborhoods define it. It's just kind of, it's wide, but I wouldn't even call it sprawling in that sense of conformity. It has all kinds of. It has a different language. Once visitors get that, or once people who move here get it, and if you're lucky, it's accessible with public transportation. There are, unfortunately, or there have been areas where it just absolutely wasn't accessible, but that is changing now. I mean, that is the interesting thing. Other than that, it's an extremely interesting mosaic and assembly of neighborhoods that I think will, that are really hard to find elsewhere.
What was your own process of coming to grips with learning the language of Los Angeles when you came here over 20 years ago?
Well, there was a thing called the Thomas Guide. You had it in your car. You had it in your car. Literally everything was way before GPS. Everywhere you went, you had to actually look it up unless you knew it well, because just the craziness of the street numbers made no sense. You would think you were meeting somebody on Wilshire, but it was actually 25 miles west because you forgot that it's west, south, or north. Yes. And by driving, in the end, really by driving, because it just kind of, that was my way to get on. And then by moving into different neighborhoods, and getting to meet people who lived in certain neighborhoods that were absolutely fascinating. I mean, coming to LA I came in the early 90s, and seeing even Chinatown at that point, before the gallery boom, already kind of you could feel it coming, or seeing neighborhoods like Silver Lake and I mean, of course, Echo Park and all these areas that had such a distinctively different vibe to anything you saw in other cities, was absolutely fascinating. And so through that, and then that circle gets bigger and bigger and bigger, and at some point becomes yours, it seems.
And Steve, you grew up here, so what was it? Was it the challenge put to you to learn how other cities worked after growing up in and around Los Angeles, or what was the challenge for you?
I'll be honest with you. The first time I went to New York, I was in heaven.
Oh yes,
yeah,
immediately.
Immediately, because It's funny. Out of college, I had an unusual job. I was a messenger and an air courier, so I had a chance to travel around the world without having to pay for it. So. As a messenger, I was driving all around LA, and I had a Thomas Guide, and I knew every area by page number back then. But I was thrilled when I would get to cities like New York. I discovered actually when I would travel to other cities that I would naturally walk more, and that I would lose weight even though I was eating a lot. And I thought, oh my gosh, this seems like a way better system. Right. In fact, I did a courier trip to Toronto and was blown away by the public transportation there, and have been actually really thrilled to see those things coming here, because again, it's just more freeing. But growing up here, it was very much a car culture. I mean, we used to. It's funny. I was just thinking about this the other day, and it's not something I do anymore. But when I was a kid, when I got my driver's license, we used to just get in the car and go for a drive. So I would drive around and explore the Santa Monica Mountains, or just drive because gas was cheap and no one gave it any thought, and you would just tool around. That is absolutely something I do not do anymore, at all.
Important to underscore, that's a good memory. That's not. It wasn't like, man, this is so terrible driving around. Like, you enjoyed that.
No, it was totally fun. You got to be kidding me. I mean, the Santa Monica Mountains, things weren't as developed. It was really, really pretty. And I would also, also when I would have different jobs and different commutes, I would always try and find the nicest commute. For a while, I lived in Santa Monica and worked in the Valley, but I would take Mulholland over and down through a canyon because it was better than being on the freeway. So, but yeah, the big change is I don't just go driving around the mountains anymore. I take walks.
Having come from Toronto, which we've alluded to, give our listeners a preview of what they're going to hear in the spring on their show. What's so cool about Toronto?
Well, the thing I think that makes Toronto very unique is it's so walkable, and everybody walks, and everybody uses public transit, and it's kind of similar to Manhattan in the sense that nobody has a car. You can't have a car because there's no parking. It's like an inhibition, basically. And the city has, over the years, put a ton of money into urban parks, and they're very, very cutting edge, very creative. For example, there's a music park that's designed around the idea of embodying works of music through landscape, and just wonderful boardwalks on the lake, and High Park, which is a massive park in the middle of the city. So it's just a wonderful place to be outside.
Stay tuned, listeners. You'll hear I'll try to record outside when I can. I mean, if the weather's okay. Here, there's some snow there, but not in the spring, right? Good.
It's very, very hot right now, apparently.
Oh, dear. This is a Canadian city, Toronto, but we've been talking mostly about American cities. Is it just, we'll say, American or North American cities where this urban revival is going on, or do other countries, major cities, do they do it too, or do they need to do it? What's the situation internationally? Do you have a sense of that as well?
A little bit. I mean, again, we haven't done an enormous amount of research yet on it, but I mean, there's a lot of talk about Copenhagen and
where the show will be going in November.
Oh, nice. Where we definitely have people you should talk to that we interviewed in New York, for instance, who there's a lot of European architecture firms who are participating in competitions for outdoor revitalization projects in the U.S. who have been very successful at that, and who have a very unique perspective on it. And so we talked to a couple of these and found that very interesting. So hearing that and then kind of reading about certain cities, how incredibly advanced occasionally that is. I think the different, I'm from Europe myself, so they're just starting at a completely different place. So you are in most, at least the capitals and the larger cities, that has never been interrupted. You never saw the slumming of the downtown areas. You don't actually have downtown areas that were kind of strictly built for corporate use. Right. They were always the centers and the hearts.
There was never the exodus post-war.
No, unless you have these brand new, obviously cities that were destroyed during the war and then were rebuilt with a different model from the 50s. But even that, you don't have the feeling when you, go to Berlin, go to Cologne, or go to even other places in Munich or Vienna or even Paris, that it has been completely erased, abandoned, neglected, handed over to I don't know what, and now this really tedious and complicated and expensive process of reclaiming entire areas of a city. That is completely not in, I would say, that European, the way it sounds, Canadian mindset. You would never do something like that. Right. So you're starting at a totally different place. The parks were always there, and didn't really kind of get destroyed. And I think that sensibility, at least the way I've been able to observe it when I still lived there, was that walkability is a great thing. People are walking much, much more. They're using trains more. Yes, if they have a car, they have a car, but very often, you have a car. I mean, it's like this scenario. You have a car. If you have a car and you have that parking spot, you just don't give it up for a month or so, and unless you have to. drive somewhere. I mean, it's that odd relationship with cars. And so point I'm trying to make is they're starting at a completely different place, and so I think you will see an enormous amount of development in this regard as well. Maybe even much more kind of even architecturally much more forward thinking also.
Another place, which we touched on in a previous episode, in South America, in Bogota, Colombia, where they started Ciclovia, and which is where they shut down the street and everybody just walks and bikes. And of course, we've had that move to LA, where we have Ciclovia. And I think they're really starting to think about walkability. And there was a great quote from the mayor of Bogota that a developed country is not a place where the poor have cars, it's where the rich use public transport. And I think that really speaks to how the world is kind of changing and really coming around and moving forward by realizing that we have to use our feet and we should not be so dependent on the automobile anymore.
I wonder if it's, from what you guys have seen, looking at American cities for City Walk, I mean, is it a process where American cities are learning from places like Bogota and European cities, or is it a process of reinventing a model that is not necessarily learning from other places, but it's an urban model for America? And how much is it looking at other places and saying, let's do that? How much is it, we got to invent a new way here for us?
I think it varies. I mean, from what we can tell, it's a combination. It's both. You have a lot of cities that they kind of go back to that Main Street model where, hey, we used to have something that worked. Manhattan was built in hundreds over the past few hundred years, and this concept completely works. I mean, this is a tight, a very defined space, but it completely works in this regard. Maybe it's safer now. That makes it more, more frequented, and it works even better. But in terms of the structure of the city, how you get from A to B, how whether you use public transportation or not, you can conquer the city by foot, and that's kind of how it's designed. So there are cities that have done this on a different scale. Like if you go to the Twin Cities, the way Minneapolis was always kind of built around these lakes and then connected with very strong public transportation, connected to their fairly small downtown, which you could also reach, by bicycle from pretty much any space around wherever you might have lived. But there was always public transportation, and then all these museums and all the public parks, and then outdoor areas, and people, spending so much time outdoors. That always worked, and it feels that came very natural. But that may also be kind of a certain, Scandinavian mindset that was brought to that area, that kind of treated that with a lot of gentleness. My feeling is San Francisco works extremely well. It's just kind of some areas have been abandoned and are slowly coming back, so it's kind of scary to walk there. But still, as a city model, it seems to still seems to follow an older tradition and somehow exists. And now,
I mean, actually, taking it a step further, instead of looking towards Europe, what's going on is a lot of the cities are rediscovering their past. I mean, we have a story about the Atlanta Beltline, and part of that story was at a certain point they built the whole place out without sidewalks, where you couldn't walk at all, and now they've taken an old railway corridor that circles the city and turned that into a series of parks and trails to unite all those neighborhoods. So it's really finding what was there before. And in one of our earlier episodes, we talk about the Olmsted thing, the
Emerald Necklace.
The Emerald Necklace. And there's a quote in the show where this woman says, back in the 1800s, they built these parks so people could have some respite from working in these factories and all this smoke. And now we're building these parks and redoing it to get people out of who sit in front of computers all day or indoors and have sedentary lifestyles, so they can also see the sky and experience the world we live in. So it's I think it's a rediscovery of where we were and getting back on the track that we were before we got diverted by an automobile kind of network.
I mean, an interesting thing for us to learn was that there's somewhat of a consensus between planners, economists, architects, city officials, that we have seen kind of the end of kind of the American dream expressed through life in the suburbs, or the developed cookie cutter models, which really came with an enormous amount of problems and really kind of seems to have run its course to the point where they can model this out from an economic standpoint and say how this has shifted. It's coming back to the cities. Everybody wants to live there, and the trend, as we picked it up, was that we are currently witnessing the slumming of the suburbs.
Slumming of the suburbs,
yikes. Which is yikes, and which is really drastic. Yeah. And you can imagine where this is going, and as opposed to the slumming of the inner cities and the downtown areas of the last 30, 40 years that wasn't, even after the cars arrived. And that, of course, is a stunning statement. But you could, if you think this through, where this is leading, how this is, the change that brings, from mindset to what we actually experience, what is a city, to how do we live, how do we get around, what do we do as a community, what does my community look like, the design challenges, all that stuff. I mean, it's also kind of the density of suddenly kind of living closer together is fascinating. But that's a massive change, and I don't see or perceive in Europe at all, because the suburbs have never actually existed in that way, because they always kind of found the place. It got a little more dense because there were more people, but in the end, these massive developments never really took place on that scale. So again, you're starting at a different point where you don't have to kind of paddle all the way back to kind of your base. But it's. I mean, you could almost call this an American rediscovery. I mean, this is a very American story to some degree, because people are discovering their cities and their communities.
Now, an episode of City Walk is built out of segments, and they cover the city and its revival from various angles, different people, different cities, different types of innovations, or different things rediscovered. When these episodes started coming together, when you were assembling them, what started emerging when you would see all this stuff put up together? Because you mentioned the connections that you would hear from people you interviewed, and then things you saw in cities. People would mention other cities and other projects, but when this stuff all came side by side, the places, the people, the things, what did you start learning from your own work, I guess, when you saw it there in its final form?
Well, here's the thing. It didn't actually emerge right away in its final form. So we were looking at a mosaic of stories. And what we knew very early on was we didn't want to do kind of a travel episode that was where one episode was dedicated to Boston, the next one to Manhattan, and then it would be called the Manhattan episode. We wanted to kind of shuffle this up and kind of interrupt the conformity of kind of what might have been the logical way to align it. So that, of course, made it more exciting, but also really difficult, because we have many more stories in the can that we're still discovering to this point. But that was really kind of that work where something emerged, and it wasn't necessarily an end result. I mean, so much still to this point. I mean, we're in episode 4 now. We just finished episode 4 of 30 minutes each, and we're still discovering severely new sides to stories we thought we knew very, very well.
What would be an example of that? Just where something new, a new part of a story comes up after the story already exists on your show?
That's very specific. But at this stage, it's very often seeing an interview for the 15th time and having edited it into other versions for 10 times, and suddenly you get nuances that so change kind of the story itself. Yeah. How could we miss this so long? Or how
the context changes a bit, widens.
It got wider and
more relevant.
Yeah, really more relevant. In fact, we had some things where the soundbite was one sentence, but then we listened and went to what they said before and what they said after, and it was like, oh yeah. So as opposed to a soundbite, it became a story. And I think that the nice thing too about this show is we've allowed the stories to tell themselves and take the way they want, take shape the way they want to take shape, which is why by design the segments are as short as 15 seconds or as long as 6 to 8 minutes, because there's that much of that story. And those things are really dictated by the sound bites we have and by what's really going on. So if there is a surprise or there were some changes, things that we thought maybe would just be, I mean, in some ways, we just finished doing the Atlanta Beltline, and we were working on it, and I thought, okay, well, there's about 3 minutes on this, and it turns out to be more like 8.5 to 9 because the view expands. And I think maybe that's what Thomas is talking about. Sometimes the scope of what we were doing expands to things that are more interesting and takes in a larger picture. I mean, that's really what it is, isn't it? That the place didn't exist, but that the story is bigger and larger than we thought. And
I mean, like the Iverson Mall Walkers. I mean, you saw that story in the screening. That was. I mean, we've lived with this for a long time, and we filmed with them repeatedly. But in this version, when we put it in this, it was also the longest we ever edited, and completely different tone. Really, very much like a film that is then short, but still, it took its time. Everything was breathing, and then it felt like they came alive, even though we had used portions in at other occasions. They came alive in a way that we had never seen before. And we were all just stunned. I mean, moved to see this even beyond how it felt before. Or two other examples. I mean, there are two examples, all recurring examples is, and I don't remember if it was at Soho House, but somebody commented on the use of B-roll, which we always knew from day one that, yes, we're going to get great interviews and we will shoot them very well. But the B-roll we acquire, and the more diligently and the more what's the word I'm looking for? Cinematically, we accomplish that. The more interesting everything else is going to be. So by spending a lot of time just kind of getting visuals of every city to kind of grab the character of it, and then now being able to weave it into all these other stories, adds in this final form now on City Walk, adds layers to these interviews that kind of every time I watch are stunning. Like, for instance, that the foot is a superhero. I mean, to the point where you finally understand what they're actually talking about. Some experts, we did some medical.
It becomes clear at that moment.
Where the pictures actually tell the story, and you sit there and you understand a medical context, like in the piece you did about the foot is a superhero, and it's really complex in the end what they're talking about, because they're trying to explain how humankind learned how to walk and what is necessary in your foot, and all these elements that you don't topple over. And we managed to show some of these elements as part of kind of the way we illustrated. And it reaches a point of clarity that we just never had before.
And one other thing that was a kind of a surprise, or that expanded as well, is when we're doing these stories, whereas before our emphasis was on actually getting out information, our emphasis now is on telling stories. And like with the Iverson Mall Walkers, when we're cutting these things, it's about, we concentrate on the characters and the people. The walking and the message is there. So as opposed to hitting that hard, we're hitting the experience hard, because that's what the show is about. And when you show that experience, then the message comes across even stronger, because at the end of it, you want to walk or you want to dance. I don't have to tell you that. I'm just showing you people having a really good time doing it. And this is even though this is a show it's called City Walk, the first word is city, and this show is really about people and walking, which adds to our humanness, and because that's what it's really about.
The Iverson Mall Walkers segment we brought up, it's especially striking, and I guess needed to be longer, because it's very much about walking. Of course, these are a group of people who, for decades have been walking this mall? Decades? They've been almost 30 years, but they've been walking this mall, and they're certainly walking, but it's not what we think of as a city. This is a setting that is the opposite of a city walk setting, to my mind. Like, this is, I see the interior of this mall watching the show, and it's like, it's almost jarring to see this sort of very normal thing we'd all think of in Southern California. We've all been to many malls over the years, but it's just like, there must have been a conversation about that, right? Like, whoa, a mall on the show. Can we put a mall on this show? I mean, was there?
Well, we felt it was a great. We saw articles about them, and the key at that point in the beginning was, wow, they're all senior citizens. Right. So they found a way to walk regularly. So the whole thing was, well, they've been doing it for 30 years. They do it 3 times a week, and most of them show up. That was the beginning. And then when we went there, the mall is grim. The parking is grim. It's cold, but there's not a single brand you'll recognize in that mall. But they show up. They've done it. They've been doing it for 30 years. The mall totally supports it. They open up early. These guys do not feel comfortable, not just because of their age, but because of the particular area in Maryland where this is located. They don't particularly feel comfortable walking around in their suburbs. They feel it's not safe. Anything from dogs to people who might attack them. And plus, what they really, really love is the community that shows up. They want to interact. So this is extremely managed. It's an oversized gym that transformed, where the mall transforms into that oversized gym, like a track, and that's what they do, and they use every inch of that for all kinds of purposes, from dancing to walking, and it was fascinating because they are unbelievably fit. And that was looking at that again a year after we had really done anything with it. It was just stunning to see, wow, this is a whole group of senior citizens who are in incredible shape. And they just really do it because they have that routine that they religiously believe in, and they just do it.
It's fascinating to watch that story of the Iverson Mall Walkers fit into the aesthetic of the show, because it's got a very distinct aesthetic. I mean, I would try to describe it myself, but I wonder how you guys would describe it, and whether you would describe the look and feel of City Walk as a goal in and of itself, like we want the show to look and feel like this, or did it emerge somehow from this material on the revival of cities sort of dictated that it look this, it's sort of a forward thinking kind of way that it sounds and that it looks and that it moves.
Well, I think we really made a conscious effort to have the vibrancy and the fast pace of the show be a representation of the life of the city itself.
Form meets substance.
Exactly. And so we always make an effort to show, not tell, so that the viewer absorbs it rather than being talked to. So we were very conscious to really have that vibrancy and like the fast cuts and the really just very alive aesthetic to the show.
And you were asking about the Iverson Mall Walkers, which actually has a slightly slower pace. Combined with what Caitlin is saying, the show itself has each episode, each segment, and beyond that, the shows have an internal rhythm to them. And sometimes we move really fast, and sometimes because the music will slow you down for a bit before we pick you up. And the Iverson Mall Walkers was just a time to just breathe. I mean, and yet the segment moves, and it ends with a dance. So, I mean, to answer your question, it is in the style of the show because it's about people celebrating walking. The show is ultimately a celebration of our feet.
And our cities.
And our cities.
And the cities that
and
make it happen. Yeah.
And the people. So
I mean, you can't separate any of those from each other. Ultimately, they're too tied in.
Yeah, it's not just a walking show.
We always felt that the show needed to have a very distinct style. So that isn't necessarily, or we actually quite the opposite. We wanted to avoid every segment feeling and looking the same way as the last one. But at the same time, we know kind of when we're sitting there and we're cutting a new piece, we know or when we're adding elements to it, we really have at this point a very clear understanding of what the style of that show is and what is not the style of that show. A joke that goes in, or people that talk, or graphics that go in may be completely inappropriate, and it may just be a totally great fit on a different, on a different program. But there's a certain line we want to walk where, yes, it's vibrant, it is the city, really strong colors, cinematic photography, yet not done in a National Geographic style way, but using the skill set of that, but then kind of speeding this up, making this very accessible and appealing without talking down to anybody, and kind of my favorite kind of in terms of reinventing the magazine show of kind of the mid-era television era of the 70s and 80s or 60s and 70s, where we really wanted to kind of take a stab at that and say, okay, this is not a format that's dead, so we don't have to dedicate one episode to one topic or one city. We can shuffle this around if something holds it all together. And we feel that, by creating the style and creating a certain way of dealing with graphics and using music, and then kind of rolling out stories that are somewhat related yet not the same. That we accomplished that really well. I mean, we're very, very happy with that, and all the way to the way. I mean, I have not seen graphics, title graphics used in that way in a long time, and not ongoing in a project where we're really trying to obscure the image with the written word, and we're using very few words, and sometimes it's literally just the city or a title of something, and we're trying to. So you're forced to kind of make an effort to look behind it for kind of, in a way, what's yet to come, and that kind of climax is really with that format for Walk Score that Caitlin developed with one of our editors, where you really are with intense, you rush through a story, a city in a way, 90 seconds with a really clever interview, usually anchoring it, or a host anchoring, or some framework. But then you rush through a city, like the points that really are of interest, to a 20 or 30-year-old today. What am I interested in, and what could I see there? But then we do this in a visual way that really reinvents the slideshow as a very animated experience that you are willing to follow and watch, and then with really intense music counterpointed to hysteria. But I mean, it's intense. The idea is very intense. The idea is smart, but the idea is not lecturing about anything. It's not a travel guide. But, just a unique, and it's different for every city. It's not museums, transportation, blah, blah, blah. It's always something else. And that's a really rewarding format to work with because, A, it has takeaway information, but you get it presented in a completely different way. So we're these are kind of where the style kind of pushes the furthest into something that we really hadn't seen. And then all that has a place in that show.
Now, listeners, you already can watch City Walk on KCET if you're in Los Angeles or Southern California. You can also watch it on the internet at KCET's website. Did you guys consider this to be some sort of combination of the best of the greatest advantages of web series and television series, those two forms? I know that's just a yes or no question, but
yeah, because it emerged. It emerged out of a web environment. It really did, and experimenting for such a long time online, and then being able to kind of dig the best in and then reinvent it for television is a great creative model, but it's also a great business model because we're also able to kind of move, help attract an audience into and move viewers into this project for television. Because we're sizable mailing lists now at this point, having been in the space for such a long time, and the web allowed us to do that, and so it's a yes, it's a big yes. Yeah.
I've been speaking here at the offices of Rigler Creative in Old Pasadena, the very walkable Old Pasadena, with the team behind the television show and internet show, however you want to watch it. You can watch it. City Walk. Caitlin, Steve, Thomas, thanks so much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
This has been Notebook on Cities and Culture. I've been Colin Marshall. You can keep up with the cultural creators, internationalists, and observers of the urban scene on the show at colinmarshall.org. Thanks. Special thanks to everyone who backed Season 4 on Kickstarter, including Joel Neville Anderson, Daniel Levin Becker, Paige Calvert, Commander Manvark, Jonathan Crow, John Cunningham, David Dawes, James DeVito, Tim Dobbs, Paul Doyle, Jake Elliott, Kevin Emmett, Lawrence English, Jonathan Filbert, Andrew Philippone Jr., Michael Fransky, John French, Themistocles Eucrucius, Will Graham, Umberto Grant, Samuel Hansen, David Hayes, Jeff Hillenbrand, Mark Hines, Andrew Johnstone, Tadeusz Andrzej Kodlubowski, Peter Kavanagh, Ted Kane, Andy Cooney, Evan Landman, Alfred Lee, James Maloney, John McDonald, Alberto Bruzos Moro, Jason Miller, Rob Montz, Daniel Murphy, Richard Nash, Aidan Nullman, Patrick O'Flaherty, Michael O'Regan, Christopher Porter, MJ Pritchett, Piers Rippey, Rob Schultz, Todd Shimoda, Cam Smith, Deborah Smith, Adam Sutherland, Maureen Kincaid Speller, Anna Traher, Thomas Unterberger, Matt Warren, Nick Weigelt, Dion Wolf, Cynthia Yang, and Wayne Wright.